Hello, good morning, and welcome to this course for Developer to Architect. This course is brought to you by Sati Learnings. We are one of the leading training partners providing on site and online training courses. You can find full catalog of our courses on www.sarthi.net. Well, you must be wondering what this course is about. To put it in very simple terms, it's a pragmatic and a lightweight guide to software architecture for software developers. This course will help you to bridge the gap between software development and software architecture and will guide to pursue the role of architect in future. Like many people, I started my career as a software developer, taking instructions from my seniors and working in teams to deliver software system. Over time, I started designing smaller pieces of software system and eventually evolved into a position where I was performing what I now consider to be a software architecture role. Well, this is a typical life cycle of any software developer to architect. So this training course, I try to summarize my experience and my learnings throughout the career. So, what are you going to focus today? Well, we'll first start with covering some basic terminology and concepts around software architecture, like what software architecture is about, what it is not, and some change in mindset for a software developer. Then we talk about a role of a software architect in a project. So what are the different artifacts which you have to deliver and so on, what are the skills required for a software architecture, and these are both technical as well as soft skills required. Then we can cover some basic principles of software architecture. This is a strategy around which you define your software architecture. Then we cover some of the basic elements or some of the critical elements which a software architect has to document, and what are the different tools, what are the different documents which we need to produce for the project delivery. And finally, we wrap up with some of the popular architecture models in the industry like SOA or MVC or the 4+1 models and so on and so forth. So without wasting any time, let's get started. Before we go into what software architecture is about, let's spend some minutes on what software architecture is not. Well, traditionally, software architecture has been associated with big design up front, like the waterfall style projects, where a team would ensure that every last element of a software design was considered before any code was written. Well, in practical purpose, I have never seen that happen. So software architecture is basically about a high-level structure of a software system and how you get to an understanding of it. So it's all about significant decisions that influence the shape of a software system rather than understanding what would be the length of every column in your database. Well, software architecture is definitely not only about boxes and diagrams. The image that many people have of software architect is of a traditional ivory tower software architect dictating instructions to the development team. It doesn't need to be like this. Modern software architects prefer an approach that favors coding, coaching, and collaborative design. Software architecture role doesn't necessarily need to be undertaken by a single person, or because always remember, coding is a great way to understand whether resulting architecture is actually going to work. Again, traditional views of software architecture often conjure upon images of huge UML diagrams that attempt to capture every last drop of details. Now, while communication is a very common and important part of any architecture, you don't need to use UML. In fact, lot of architects would argue that UML isn't the great method for communicating software architecture. And if you can keep simple guidelines, lightweight boxes and lines, and some simple sketches, you will find most often not they are a very effective way of communication of software architecture. Well, now that we've seen some of the aspects which software architecture is not, can you just let me know what you think software architecture is, or what software architecture actually means to you? Well, the word architecture means different things to different people. If you try to Google around software architecture, you will get thousands of different definitions. And I can assure you that this will evolve over time. I have asked hundreds of people over the past few years what architecture means to them. And I have often gotten very funny and very weird answers to them. I've heard some people saying that it's all about the bigger picture. Some would say it's about modules, connections and dependencies amongst them. And some would say that architecture is about blocks, which are expensive and difficult to change. Some would say it's about interfaces rather than implementation. You'll get so many definitions around, and I'm not saying all of these definitions are wrong, but it's such a vast field that it's very difficult to cover into a single sentence or single definition of a term. According to me, without raising any controversies, architecture is basically about understanding what you need to build, creating a vision for building it, and making appropriate decisions to support it. Crucially, what most architects forget is architecture is all about communication. Remember, we have to communicate a vision of what the project or what the system is going to look like. And that's the reason why I said most of the architects would say UML is not the best way of doing it. Architecture is, as I said, communicating a vision and introducing a technical leadership so that everybody involved in the construction of the product understands this vision and is able to contribute to this vision in a positive way for its success. So in other words, architecture is anything and everything related to the significant elements of a software system, from the structure and the foundation of the code through to the successful deployment of that code into a production environment. Now that we are talking about some definition of what architecture is, I think it's a good time to introduce you to the first change which you have to implement in your approach or in your mindset when you look at a software architect as a role. Well, when you're thinking about software development as software developers, most of our focus is placed on the code. Here we are thinking about concepts like object-oriented, classes, interfaces, inversion of control, unit testing, clean code, and various other technical practices which your organization enforces on you to build a better software. However, when you're thinking about an architect role, our scope widens to more than just code. Here, an architect also thinks about cross-cutting concerns like logging, exceptional handling, and so on. You also have to think about security, performance, scalability, availability, and all other quality attributes which define a software system. I'll cover these principles or quality attributes later during our course. But it's very important that you keep a mind on that, on what are the different authentication or authorization strategies of your project. How are you going to save your sensitive data? You also have to think about regulatory requirements which might differ from country to country, and also the auditing requirements which again might differ from industry to industry. You also have to think about operational support. It's no good having a system which doesn't really runs in a production environment and on the team who's going to maintain it doesn't understand. You also have to think about consistency in approach to solve problems or to implement features across the code base. And finally, you also have to think about some real world problems which you might face, an ecosystem in which your system is going to live. So, now that you understand how you have changed your mindset to think like an architect, let's just talk for very briefly about what are the benefits of software architecture process, or do you think there are any real benefits out of it? Well, just to quote a few, a well-defined software architecture provides you a clear vision and roadmap for the team to follow. Now, that vision can be owned by a single person or collectively by a whole team. A software architecture team defines a technical leadership. Software architecture is probably the person whom the entire team would go to or will look upon to give them some direction in case of some technical challenges. This helps better coordination and thus results in a better delivered project. Software architecture also defines you a framework which is then useful to identify or mitigate any risks at a very early stages of the project. As I said, software architecture defines a consistent approach to solve any problems. This leads to a well-structured code base. A good software architecture gives you a firm foundation on which the entire project is built. And as you are, if the foundation is good, more often than not, your project will be delivered successfully. Software architecture is also a stimulus for other people in the project to answer some questions related to the non-functional designs, to the security or to the constraints of the system. Well, these are a few benefits which I have quoted. Just a question for you. Do you think every project needs a software architecture?